Hey folks, welcome to the Knowledge Building and Rural Creative Placemaking webinar. My name is Matthew Fluharty. I'm the Executive Director of Art of the Rural, and we're really glad to have you all with us today. And we're so excited to have these four panelists with us in the mix for today's conversation. I'm gonna get out of the way in a second here, but just wanted to give you all a little bit of context around today's digital exchange. In 2016, with the support of the National Endowment for the Arts, Art of the Rural and the Rural Policy Research Institute launched Next Generation, which was an initiative focused on bridging conversation, collaborations, and cross-sector network building in the rural creative placemaking field. Next Generation operates through three interlinked activities: cross-sector regional networks, digital learning commons, which folks can find at ruralgeneration.org, and a national rural creative placemaking summit. The inaugural meeting of that summit was last fall in Iowa City and brought together 300 people from 38 states to all come together and talk about the future of this work. So after that, to build upon the collective energy and spark further national dialogue, these next generation digital exchanges are seeking to kind of bridge that power of connection, push further conversation forward into regions, sectors, and place-based philosophies that sometimes may not be in direct conversation with each other. These conversations happen roughly every 3 weeks and offer an opportunity for great leaders to come together and talk, but also for a wide range of folks from around the field and related fields to listen in, whether live now or with us in the archive format later. Each of these 1-hour digital exchanges feature 3 to 4 voices from across the country, generally sharing ideas around a specific theme, challenge, or opportunity that we collectively encounter. And I think it's kind of important to say that while some of these elements do resemble a webinar format we're really familiar with, our hope is that this conversation is improvisational, and to the best that we can transcend this digital format, how can we make a very un-webinary webinar? Just a space where we can kick around ideas and make connections. So kind of to those ends, for folks who are joining us here, if you look at the screen that's in front of you, you'll see there are kind of 2 important icons I want to call folks' attention to. The first is the chat function in the bottom center of the screen. It has a little comic book dialogue thing there. As our conversation is moving forward today, feel free to drop any ideas or links that you'd like to contribute as the conversation goes forward. We'll be sharing important links to all the folks' work who are sharing today as well. And then also 2 spaces to the left, you'll see a little box for Q&A. And as our panelists are discussing their work and making connections, feel free to ask questions of them. The final 15 to 20 minutes of our 1-hour conversation will be directly addressing your all's questions. So please feel free to use that as questions come up. This digital exchange was created in partnership with the Rural Policy Research Institute and is made possible through the support of the National Endowment for the Arts and the McKnight Foundation, 2 of the most sort of generous and vibrant entities we have holding up rural culture in our country. We're grateful for their support. This digital exchange is produced at the Outpost Collaborative Space in Winona, Minnesota, which is headquarters of Art of the Rural. And really, without further ado, we're really excited to have these 4 folks with us today. They're going to explain their work and introduce themselves more deeply in just a moment here, but just in brief, we're grateful for Kylie Arroyo to be a moderator for us today. Kylie is the Executive Director of the Cultural Strategies Council and is also a part of the RUPRI NEA Lab. Also, Judy Jennings is with us from Kentucky. She's the NEA Project Director for Creative Placemaking from the Community Up. And in general, I have to say, is a force of nature. We're really glad to have Judy with us today. Really grateful for it. Also, if we jump across the Appalachians and the Plains to Kansas, we're really excited Erica Nelson is with us. Erica is an artist, a curator, and has also just authored a white paper on rural public art policy with Americans for the Arts. Grateful to have Rachel with us. And also just upriver from where we are in Winona, we're really excited to have Carla Tia Swanson with us, who is a member of Springboard for the Arts and is also one of the forces behind the Creative Exchange website and digital exchange format, which is just producing really amazing content every week and helping animate the conversation. So without further ado, thank you so much for y'all being with us. Thanks to folks who are joining us around the country. And I'm going to pass the mic to Kylie.
Thanks so much, Matt, and thanks to everybody who's joined us. Thanks to the NEA and the McKnight Foundation. Uh, I'm delighted to be a part of today's conversation and to speak with all of you, both the panelists and those of you who have joined us from different parts of the country. This is a topic that's near and dear to me. You know, the idea of knowledge building and knowledge mobilization is central to the work that I do, both with the Cultural Strategies Council that really works at this intersection of place-based arts and culture, equitable development, and public policy, and uses a combination of research, strategy, and organizational learning to bring actors from those three domains together to work together in different ways and to really advance more comprehensive approaches. So this is a topic that is right up my alley and certainly up the alley of all of the other panelists. Just to speak briefly, Matt mentioned I'm also a part of the RUPRI family. And as a senior research fellow with RUPRI, I'm working with them to lead the NEA Research Lab, which is about a year ago, the National Endowment for the Arts selected a handful of universities across the country to essentially take a piece of its research agenda and really run with it. And we made the case that we really needed to lift up more knowledge about the function and value of culture outside of cities and really build that piece of the knowledge base which we felt was missing. So we were selected to focus on ways that arts and culture enable innovation and entrepreneurship in rural areas. And not only innovation and entrepreneurship in the traditional sort of economic sense, but civic innovation and political entrepreneurship. So we're focusing on that right now. We're just getting started. But we're really excited to use this work to enable more inclusive dialogue about the state of arts and culture in very different parts of the country. So with that, I'd like to introduce Erica Nelson, who is going to speak to us about some of the knowledge building products that she's been creating, who they're for, some of their functions, some of the benefits, and some of the barriers that she has encountered with that work. And then she'll be passing it along to the others. And through each of these mini presentations, we really want to give you a sense of sort of the state of play when it comes to knowledge building for creative placemaking, not only in rural America, but further out, and what the future of that might look like. So with that, Erica, it's off to you.
Thank you, Kylie. I'm coming to you today from the high plains in central Kansas. I live in a town of 400 people that's been billed as a grassroots art community. So at its very core, from 100 years ago, we've had this giant outsider art environment that grew up along with the town. And so in being in an arts town that doesn't call itself an arts town, I've gotten to explore policies that are written for arts organization and the implementation of arts that sometimes doesn't really fit in with a rural, either rural sensibilities or rural wants and needs. So been looking at policies that are written for a bigger organization and trying to fight to apply those to very small, very local, very rural communities. And I think all of this can translate to urban communities also that feel like policies have been put on top of them as opposed to growing from them. So recently I had the opportunity to write a white paper for Americans for the Arts, talking about grassroots growth of creative cultures, programming public art for rural areas, addressing some of those issues. So I looked at 3 case studies, one being the rural-urban exchange that happens between metro and rural areas in Kentucky, one looking at Worm Farm Institute that's created a farm art detour that takes a route through a county crisscrossing not only their cultural landscape, but their geographical landscape and their cultural landscape, tying those together with art interventions, both coming from outside, but also coming from within, and exploring the depth of expression that can happen when rural arts grows as opposed to being applied. And also my adopted home community of Lucas, as I mentioned before, a town of 400 in the Great Plains. And it's like Norman Rockwell meets Twin Peaks as far as the sensibilities within the town and what Lucas has been becoming known for. So the point of the paper was to sort of look at why some of these policies don't feel like they always apply to rural, or giving rural a voice in the shaping of these policies. So the intended audience for this paper was really towards policymakers and those looking to enter into this conversation to shape how policies can apply to my neighbors, not just me, because I've been sort of folded into this world for a while. But how do you explain rural policy making and open rural policy making to your neighbor? Your, not just your neighbor, but your neighboring business that might be a hair salon, your other business that's a farm implement dealer, who might not think that arts and culture apply to their specific life, but in living in Lucas, the citizens here know that this big, strange, weird beast of art is a part of them and a resource, and has driven some economic change within this town for the last 100 years. That was the intended audience and intention of the resource itself. And one of the main things that I found in talking to not just my own town, but these other communities that are really looking for a way to create policy that talks to a wider audience, is that it is about talking. It's about communication and maybe being a translator. How do you translate a jargon world to a no-nonsense world, or a industry specific to arts and culture to industry specific to agriculture or education? We all live in these worlds of language that don't always cross over and butt up against each other, not just from us, but from the other worlds that we're talking to. So how do we address that and become translators in our own lives, explaining our own practices, but also trying to create resources that aren't blankets, that don't relate either to culture or to the language within the community in which you're trying to work and grow. That's sort of an overview of what resource that I've been trying to develop for rural and put out there in the world to expand the conversation. I'm very happy to be on here today with some amazing folks, and I would like to pass the talk on to Judy Jennings. And so let me find, oh no.
I can say it.
Well, I just lost my screen. I was scrolling up, and then this is the fun part about rural and access. My connection just slowed way down because all of the rest of the businesses just opened an hour ago, so our bandwidth shrinks in a town of 400. So I'd like to pass this to Judy Jennings, director of the Kentucky Foundation for Women Feminist Art for Social Change in Kentucky. And thank you for being on here with everybody.
Oh, I'm so honored to be on. It's a great call, and thanks to all the people that are calling in. I do hasten to say that I am the retired director of the Kentucky Foundation for Women, because there's a great new person who's the director, Sharon LaRue. I'm also working, it's been really interesting. There's no such thing as retirement. It's just working in another way without pay, but, or sometimes you can pay, but I'm really happy to be a part of another National Endowment for the Arts Creative Placemaking Knowledge Building cohort. And there's 4 of us in that cohort. I'm representing the Kentucky Cultural Organizing Learning Exchange, which is in its 6th year. Arts and Democracy, which some of you might know, that's based in New York, does amazing. Also a cultural organizing workshop in Brooklyn every year, participatory budgeting, wonderful work. The Arts Foundation for Tucson and Southern Arizona, which is fascinating in the desert, in the Sonoran Desert, doing wonderful work with all the rich culture there, and LA Commons in Los Angeles. And so our cohort is community building from the creative placemaking from the community up. And in these very different geographical locations, we're finding many similarities. Similarities across geographies and also similarities across urban rural. So that's been very exciting. I'm going to be writing 3 national pieces about short pieces, and so stay tuned for those. If you have any places you would like to have offers to see published about these similarities, what we're learning across the geographic and urban rural, just shoot me an email and I would be happy to keep you informed. Right now we're at the sort of beginning of our cohort work, and we did 2 interesting, pretty different presentations on the national level over the summer. And the first one was at the American Planners Association meeting, which is 20,000 urban planners all coming together in New York City. And we had a standing room only crowd of more than 200 who wanted to talk about creative placemaking from the community up. So it was a very pleasant surprise to know that these largely dominated urban planners wanted to learn from community-based work in urban and rural areas. We had a great conversation. We're going to actually post that PowerPoint on the NEA Creative Placemaking page. So stay tuned for that. And then I went to I also represented Arts and Democracy at the Allied Media Conference, which is, it's in its 11th year, but it's a lot of great young people, most mainly it's a DIY for social justice, I think, and they're very technology savvy. And it meets every year in Detroit, and they were concerned with urban design, not just urban design, and a lot of good discussion there. So there's a lot more national interest. I'm happy to say there's a lot more national interest than I might have thought starting out in our work that we're doing in the urban rural areas. I did want to hold up one good example, and I'm also a longtime board member of Appleshop Media Arts and Education Center in the coalfields of Appalachia in Letcher County. And they had a wonderful Our Place America grant called Culture Hub. And I think Savannah's going to chat that link out to you all. But Appleshop is getting ready to be 50 years old. It's one of the grandmothers of the community-based, grew out of the war on poverty, community-based social change, creative placemaking. And now the Culture Hub is reimagining the role of Appleshop in their own community with the coal economy crashing with the political differences we have between urban and rural in Kentucky. Appleshop has got a great model of the Culture Hub, which I can talk more about. But I think my time is up. And I'm going to bounce the ball over. We're very basketball oriented in Kentucky. I'm going to do a pass over my basketball to Carla Tia Swanson, who is the Associate Director of Springboard for the Arts, which is really a national model in this kind of work we're doing. They've been doing it a long time. And I believe Carla has been involved in artist-led community development especially. So take it away, Carla.
Hello, everybody. I think that can everyone hear me? I've heard. Excellent. So my name is Carla Tia Swanson. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Judy. And I'm the Associate Director at Springboard for the Arts. We're a 26-year-old now, nonprofit that is artist-led for artists. And so we work around artists making a living in a life. And that includes shaping their community and being a part of their community. We, in our guiding principles, see artists as integral community members, and that every community has artists, whether or not those people call themselves artists or not, people who are creating things that make meaning and make relevance in people's lives. We want to encourage them as artists and as community members. In my work at Springboard for the Arts, I get to work with a lot of really amazing community development specialists, folks who are doing work here in our St. Paul office, like Junlee Wong and Peter Hoken Thompson, and from our Fergus Falls office, Michelle Anderson and Naomi Schliesman, people who are doing really wonderful on-the-ground work. And so we do have this urban and this rural context for our work, and we are able to cross-pollinate ideas and to see how things are both different and how they're very much the same in some ways. We're talking about giving artists the tools to build partnerships, creating partnerships with unlikely suspects, with unusual friends. We do a lot of work in starting small and building relationships that can then grow and be reciprocal over time and not as transactional as some other relationships might be. And we started doing creative placemaking work about 7 years ago in the Twin Cities area with some local partners. And then that grew into a ArtPlace funded 3-year-long project called Irrigate, which was along the Green Line light rail construction corridor that cut through the city of St. Paul. And we were able to, through essentially a community organizer training model for artists, train artists on building partnerships and then fund them to do small projects with local businesses or nonprofit organizations along the Green Line. And the way that we formulated that project, and this has been true for the way that we think about creative placemaking in all of our work that we do, is that we wanted to work with artists who lived, worked, or had a significant connection to the affected area of the Green Line. So we were specifically looking to work with the people who were in the community, who were of the community, who were being affected by the issues in the community. And that's been the same for the work that we've done in Fergus Falls as well, where there's been a lot of interest around development of the Kirkbride building, which is a 1 million square foot building in the middle of Fergus Falls that used to be a state mental health hospital. That industry is gone, but the identity of a caregiver and the legacy of that building still looms large over the city and over the town and residents as they figure out what to do with themselves and what their next steps are. And it's been through artist-led interventions and a lot of arts-led projects that people have been able to have further discussions and claim a narrative that both honors their history but then moves them forward into the future as well. And that's really where we see artists as having a lot of power in the creative placemaking world. Artists are people who tell and shape and share stories, and so by being able to activate artists and put them in partnership with formal structures of power or informal structures of power, we're able to really shape the world around us. We partnered last year with the International Downtown Association and the NEA to create a version of the Irrigate Toolkit, where we're sharing all of our resources and templates to create a resource that's specifically for managers of business districts. So how do people who are on that administrative or business side work with artists? As we see, we have a role to play in bringing both businesses and organizations and structures to artists, and then also artists up to those structures. So we want to be bridge builders. We want to be translators in between those worlds. And we offer on our Creative Exchange platform, springboardexchange.org, all these toolkits and then storytelling about artists who are making an impact in their community. And by doing those things together in tandem, bringing artists and giving artists more capacity to work in creative placemaking circles, and by creating tools for organizations to work with artists, we're able to better work together from the ground up, from the community up, and from the artists who are in the community. So I think that's my time right there. I'm going to throw it back to Kylie, who will lead the conversation here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much to each of you. And you were so speedy. We'll have ample time for a nice conversation. A lot of interesting common threads there and some unique differences. I just want to share a couple of observations before we jump into the questions. You know, this certainly the shared theme around dialogue, and the goal of creating tools that really helps to facilitate more inclusive dialogue between a variety of different actors, whether it's local residents and policymakers, artists and local residents, business people and local arts organizations, you name it, but developing knowledge and resources that really enables that kind of dialogue and is very intentional about that translation. I think we all know is absolutely key. You bring a very diverse cast of characters together when you do this work, each who comes to it from very different traditions of practice with their own language, their own tools, their own timelines. How do you create resources that really speak to each of them and don't necessarily privilege one over the other, but helps to build common understanding and shared understanding is, I think, a goal for all of our work. Also, this theme of what I would actually call intercultural dialogue, and not just in the sense of bringing individuals from different racial or ethnic or sort of cultural backgrounds together, but intercultural in the sense of these sectors having their own culture of work, right? how do you create tools that facilitates dialogue that recognizes that portions of the community development sector and portion of the arts or social justice, they work differently. They have worked differently. And part of the opportunity of creative placemaking is finding new ways to bring them together to really honor those strengths and to create a different approach to community development that is more comprehensive by nature. So I would throw that out as a theme. Another theme that each of you spoke to a little bit is the relationship between knowledge building and adaptation, right? Whether it's organizational adaptation in the sense of Apple Shop, you know, in the way that the cultural hub work and the knowledge that it's producing is helping that organization reinvent itself and its function moving forwards. Adaptation in the sense, Erica, in the communities you looked at, of how local residents can participate in policymaking, which can seem like this very mystifying sort of act, but doesn't need to be. You know, and similarly so with respect to the wonderful work of Springboard. You know, how do you really drive adaptation? How do you help artists work differently? How do you help different stakeholder groups work with artists differently? And I think that's all based on this idea that we all have some skills when we come to this work, but we also have some gaps and we need to learn some things. And that learning is a real opportunity to grow and sort of revitalize our work. And that's a real plus. So with that, I'd love to throw some questions out there and then open it up to all of our participants as well. So I'll continue in the same order unless one of you feels like you want to jump in right away. So the first one is, so what's been the most surprising or unexpected thing you've learned through the work that you've done, either personally or professionally? What's really, what did you not expect? And Eric, why don't I throw that to you?
One of the things that I didn't expect was the absolute want and need to be a part of it. I sort of assumed in talking to arts organizations within rural communities that they would feel like they were in a bubble, but if anybody has ever done a project in a town less than 10,000 people, you understand very quickly that it is all so super interconnected, and while people might not have put a label on it or put a name on it, they know that inherently. You know that you need to know somebody with a front loader if you're going to get a sculpture into a place that doesn't have a crane attached to it. So this sort of inherent web is already there. The surprising thing was that people know it in their bodies, but they don't know it in their minds or their language. And when you stop talking about the language around the arts and just start doing the stuff, it's easy. It becomes hard when we have the layers of language or the layers of policy that seem to create those barriers. So seeing how really easy it is to do amazing things in rural was the good surprise that changed my assumption about the difficulties it is to create communities that are really embracing creativity from the ground up.
Excellent. Judy?
Thanks. That's great, Erica. I think I've been surprised at how embracing people are of talking across the rural urban, I'm not even going to say divide, talking across rural urban places. We in Kentucky, we have 3 major metropolitan areas and a very rural state. So we have some pretty contentious context sometimes, especially since the last few months. But when we get the most particularities of place is when you get the greatest similarities. It's so interesting. So I know we participate. I went to the Brooklyn Cultural Organizing Learning Exchange, and so many people were losing art. Some of the really good arts people in Brooklyn actually came out of Kentucky or West Virginia or places like that, and they're happy to hear from home. And even those who haven't been in our state, they can participate in story circles about that use the same tools that we use and understand that works in urban areas just as well as rural areas where we'd like to tell stories. And in Detroit at the Ala Media Conference, people in Detroit really are doing urban gardens, and they're going back to those traditions that people from the Black Exodus and the Appalachian Exodus of the South brought to Detroit. And they know that. They value that. They know that's part of their heritage. So there's a lot of hope to build the bridges and share it through the cultural expressions that are really interlinked.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, Judy.
Carl.
Interesting.
I always have to give this caveat whenever I'm talking about rural communities, is that I'm a city kid, is that I grew up in large cities, but my family comes from farmers, and so I spent time in the country. But I think that to Judy was just talking about not talking about it as a divide. I think that is the most joyful surprise of all this, is that there is such a rich practice of artists and of community-led and community-driven art in rural communities. And that often gets overrun by media narrative, by a very simplistic media narrative. And so finding ways to break through that and to tell different stories about who people are and how they're living, and then how those exchanges can happen. We've touched on this a little bit, but there is, I think, so much more in common with rural communities and underinvested urban neighborhoods that we can be doing to tie those people together and build reciprocity and build relationship there. Urban farms in Detroit are happening because people need food in Detroit, just like farming is happening in rural communities because people need food there. So building those relationships, I think, is both a surprise and an ongoing task and challenge.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks to each of you. Just to pull on a couple of those threads, starting with you, Carl, really that idea of reciprocity and building these relationships across lines and using knowledge of each other, knowledge of place to really help to facilitate that dialogue and to build that kind of cohesion, I think is a major goal and opportunity of knowledge building in this space, and something that the arts and culture sector more broadly is uniquely positioned to offer other issue areas as well. Back to, again, this language challenge and translation challenge, being consistently mindful of what people understand and what they don't understand, and what really invites participation and what makes that difficult, being absolutely key in the creation of this knowledge. And working backwards to you, Erica, this wonderful idea that, there is all of this tacit place-based knowledge in people, right? Their lived experience holds a wealth of information about place. I'd like to think that's why we do creative placemaking, right? We use these creative practices to really reveal that knowledge, that insight, and to use that to shape the physical development of place as well as its cultural development, its political development, so on and so forth. So I think it would make sense then that knowledge building in the creative placemaking space also really tries to tap that tacit knowledge, as well as the expert knowledge that each of us brings. And I think you made a very good point very swiftly, but I want to make sure we lift it up, around the ways that not only language can be a barrier, to accessing that knowledge, but the structures that are in place. So for example, the political structures that might be in place at a municipal level, they might not have a ladder per se down to the ground, right? To make sure that you're really lifting up those local voices and ensuring those insights are informing the future shape of policy. So again, I think we've got a real opportunity here to make sure that when we do our design work, it's not just of physical places, but we're also looking at the different structures that shape those places. So I thank you all for raising all of those really critical points. Looking to the future a little bit before we turn it over to our broader participants, how do you see the work of creative placemaking changing in the next 10 years? And how do you see those changes impacting rural communities? But I also welcome you to think about it more broadly than that.
I think terms come and go. So I know creative placemaking has sort of suffered from being co-opted as a development tool only for perception-wise for some communities, that it's become a label in and of itself. So what I can talk to or about would be, where is my town going to be in 10 years? And if I'm saying that as an artist, that means that I need to step up to that role in participating in either making my town a better place or creating opportunities for others to make their community a better place, our community a better place. And as a person who works in the creative worlds, that means that I need to feel that my voice is as valued as the motel that's contributing to the bed tax that supports our county's funding structure for cultural institutions. So for me, in the next 10 years, I see a lot more civic engagement from people who want their communities to reflect them. And that does mean that we as creatives need to do that same sort of stepping up of, if we see that a voice or a way of thinking is isolating as opposed to encompassing, that is a path to creating a community that embraces all of its, not just industries, but all of its components in that equal measure. And part of that is being active and not assuming that somebody else has your voice, or not assuming that somebody else is going to speak to your concerns in the same way. One of my favorite installations here in town is from a person who does not feel like he has a voice in town. So he's created Fencebook. He's not on social media, but he has a fence in the middle of downtown where he posts his gripe. He physically paints them out and posts them on Fencebook, so that he is not just creating a dialogue in a transient space, he's physically posting his concerns in town because he doesn't feel like the city is listening to him or his neighbors are listening to him. And my hope is that the next neighbor will also do a Fencebook post, or people will start stopping and considering not just their own bubble, but the next one over. And I think because our conversations do start to acknowledge that more and more and more, eventually we won't need the label of creative placemaking. It will become ingrained. And I think that it is starting. And I do think the conversations about rural is starting too on the more global national policy making, but also in this whole interconnected world, that I think the goal of creative placemaking should be to almost eliminate itself, that's going to be a given. And I do feel like we're on that path. It does take some careful language and some careful negotiation within yourselves and within your communities.
That's great. Thanks so much, Erica. Judy, how about you? What does the future hold from your perspective?
Well, I think that there is a growing understanding and realization that rural areas, rural people have a lot to offer for solutions for the future. Mm-hmm. We're bruised and battered, but we're not down and out, that's for sure. And we still have community intact. Yep. Even though it's we're hurting in many ways. But I was just in Whitesburg, where Apple Shop is located, a town of 1,200 in the coal fields. And I was walking down the street and I ran into an old friend I hadn't seen in like 5 years, and the county judge and the mayor. And they're all like, "Oh, it's great you're here. Thank you for coming and seeing what's going on." And they are proud to show their town. They're proud to show what's happening down there. So I think when we talk about civic engagement, there's more hope on the local level. There is now that we're really realizing, like, oh, we can make a change here. We can do this project. We can talk to our neighbors. We have great farmers markets all over the county now. And I was there, if you have 12 people, is that 1% of your population or 2 or 10 if you have 1,200? I can't do math. But anyway, 12 people is a lot of people in a town of 1,200, is my point. So it's happening, and I think people are realizing it, and I think there are real lessons to be learned.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Carl?
Yeah, I think that sort of on a very practical, tactical level, I mean, the fact that Judy went and presented to the Association of Planners shows where we're going to be in 10 years. I mean, this is the practice of working with artists and working with local creative people, engaging them in community programs, and building new structures that are designed to engage people at the local level and engage creativity at the local level. I think that's where we're headed. I mean, and sort of from the inverse of that, one of my favorite side effects of some creative placemaking work in Fergus Falls was that a man who was cast in a play about the history of Fergus Falls and the Kirkbride building was so driven by that experience that he then ran for city council and is now a city council member. I mean, I think that finding new ways to create agency and taking some formal agency in our communities is also a side effect of creative placemaking. When people feel like they actually have a voice and a way to shape things inside of their community, people get more involved and more engaged. So that's sort of on the tactical, practical level, that people will be more used to these things happening and therefore design for them and feel more agency around them. On a more philosophical level, I feel like we are talking about what is the value of our cultural currency, of our cultural heritage, and how do we talk about that and put that into play in a more meaningful way. Let's not just talk about value in terms of economic value, but let's talk about our community, our history, our relationships, and let's talk about how valuable those things are. And I feel like creative placemaking offers us a space, because artists have been doing it for a long, long time, to talk about both the tactical and practical ways we do things, but also philosophically how we value each other as fellow citizens, as fellow human beings.
Beautiful, Carl. A beautiful place to end. And I would just touch on that for 1 second, something I didn't say at the start. You know, some of the work that we're doing with RUPRI through the NEA Lab is to build on their comprehensive wealth creation and distribution framework, which is a 10-year-old framework, very refined, which really promotes a more comprehensive definition of community wealth that not only includes the cultural capital of place, but the social capital, the financial capital, the natural capital, you name it, and building out both the social and the cultural piece so that we can really advocate for that broader definition of community health and resilience and vitality, so that those kind of strategies are supported a little differently. So from the top down, we're trying to hit that as well. Excellent points made by all three of you. I'm going to throw this open to the audience, but I just want to just pull on three threads that you each spoke to, which I heard really as, you know, this participatory citizenship. You know, this creative placemaking work has sort of galvanized activity in communities of all kinds, but I think we all see a real opportunity for that to really continue to evolve into a culture of participatory citizenship and really leveraging the agency that creative placemaking has produced in order to ensure that more people feel like legitimate stakeholders in the shaping of place. And I think in a lot of communities, that's not necessarily the case, but we can start to shift that. And again, I think the arts and culture community more broadly is really leading that charge in a lot of ways, because we already see the possibility and our perception has already been shifted, whether it's from the urban rural sort of artificial divide or you name it. And so again, I think we're on the front lines to really galvanize that and to enable that. You each spoke to a variety of different outcomes you'd like to see in the future. I would just encourage us to continue to think about, well, then how will our knowledge building products and the way that they're deployed really advance those outcomes, and really keeping those front of mind. You know, what kind of skills and capacities are needed to build that bridge to the future? It sounds like we're well on our way. So with that, I'd love to hear from the participants who have been so patiently listening. And I see we have at least one question. And Matt, if there's a way to unmute the panelist, I'm not sure if that's necessary. But if not, I'd welcome you to throw your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A box. It looks like we have at least one. And I see there's a couple in the chat box. So let's just go in that order. So in terms of Q&A, so it looks like we have a particular question for Judy. Judy, you mentioned do-it-yourself social justice. What was that in reference to? And could you explain a little bit more about it?
Yeah, I kind of just made that up right now when we were talking, but I was talking about Allied Media Conference because it's a very collaborative plan. I think it's an Allied Media Conference represents a next generation of leadership and positioning and leadership, collective leadership with a lot of input, very inclusive. And so they have last year in their conference, they taught people how to do their own health impact assessment. I'm working on a health impact assessment now, and if I wish I would have been at that workshop last year, because I'm sure they explained it in ways that you could really make it easy to apply in your own community. So they're like keeping tabs on what's happening, but then they're bringing it back to their communities and using technology and language and structures that really engage people, and so and that people can take home with them. So that's what I was meant in terms of how they are doing it yourself. They're not waiting for other people. They're not waiting for grants. You know, they're really like, what are the needs? What can we do together? Here's how to do it, and keep going.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Judy. We've got a question here in the chat box. Who's coming from us from Redding? Rachel from Redding, California, and I'm in almost Sonoma County, California, so we're not too far away. So Rachel is asking, what is your recommended short list of organizations that are institutions of power within the context of this idea of connecting artists to structures of power? Rachel, I'm happy to field that, and I'd love for the participants to connect as well. In my experience, that has to happen in different ways in different communities. In the same way that you would map your cultural assets, you would map your political assets and those kind of structures of power. Who has power? Who has influence? Who is shaping decisions in your community that affect the way that resources and opportunities are distributed? And that might be your municipal agency, it might be some other entities, but taking the time first to understand what sort of that distribution system looks like and who are the players within that system, so you can start to connect the dots and work with that. So anyone else want to add to that? And be patient.
Well, I would say that if you count power being money, funding sources would be important, and I think that we still have a ways to go on the fine art funding sources, being more inclusive to grassroots, and even public sources, I think, often have a ways to go. So I think to think about how artists can be self-sufficient, and how they can't always be self-sufficient. I'm not wanting to put it on the artists. I'm just saying, I do think we need to change the funding sources. But in the meantime, we've been trying for a pretty long time. In the meantime, figure out ways to maybe Carla can talk about this. Do you all figure out ways for them to have earned income artists when they're doing that kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we definitely do is when we're talking about, you know, if you're building out a creative placemaking program, to figure out how you're going to pay artists in that. And then how artists are going to work with, say, with businesses to provide useful services to them. I mean, and we are also approaching it from the other side. One of our core parts of our work is around business and professional entrepreneurial skills and development for artists themselves. So if you go on Creative Exchange, one of the major toolkits we have there is a 12-part curriculum for artists, by artists, on basic business skills and entrepreneurial mindsets. So I think that's part of this whole bringing organizations and then bringing artists up to meet each other in the middle there.
Yeah. And I would just have one more quick thing to that with respect to power in communities. Every community also has a lot of informal power and influence. And if all of you aren't familiar with the Wildflower Institute's research, they've done some incredible work to map the informal capital of communities and have found some really interesting correlations between collectives and informal organizations that come together to affect change in communities as being more sustainable and in some ways more impactful than those that are more traditional, because they're motivated by different means. They didn't get a grant to do the work, they're doing it for other reasons. So making sure that if you do take the time to sort of map that power and influence and opportunity in place, by no means leave out the sort of informal networks, which are in many cases much stronger. I'd like to address this question. So Karen Miller, Karen, I don't know where you're from, but that's all right. She's saying, how are you addressing the apparent lack of participation of people of color in creative placemaking, and also how it is defined by them? Excellent question. I'd love for each of the panelists to speak to that.
Yeah, I can talk to that a little bit. I mean, first, I think that there are really amazing POC-led organizations that are doing creative placemaking work. First People's Fund, alternate routes here in my Twin Cities area, Juxtaposition Arts, Intermedia Arts, Asian Economic Development Agency. I mean, there are a lot of POC-led organizations that are doing really amazing work in defining what their community needs and what the physical built environment around them needs. And they should be funded, and they should be funded fully to do that kind of work. We have reciprocal relationships and cross-sector partnership building as a key guiding principle for Springboard's work. And so we do try and leverage what we have learned and done and the relationships we've built to be able to partner with organizations to help them do creative placemaking work. And that's manifested in our work here in the Twin Cities in partnerships with the Native American Community Development Institute, Aurora St. Anthony Neighborhood Development, NDC Corporation, working with specifically Native American artists, or working specifically with African American artists, we create essentially a scaffold and then let them shape it within their own systems. So being really adaptable and not strict or structured around the way that we approach creative placemaking work, I think is really key to bringing more people in and to cultural literacy and fluency in this work. Recognizing that communities of color have been doing creative placemaking work in their own communities for longer than white people have been Columbusing it. And so recognizing that and finding ways to elevate those stories to get funding to those organizations that are historically also underfunded.
Yay to what Carl said. That's excellent. The Kentucky Cultural Organizing Learning Exchange, actually, because we're a predominantly white state, we did take on racial equity, building racial equity through cultural organizing, and we are in our 6th year now of doing the cultural organizing learning exchange, and intentionally, especially in an all-white, in predominantly white state, you have to really be intentional. You really have to you have to build the relationships and not just say, come to my meeting. Everybody know, I think that's people know, but we worked with alternate routes to help have a dialogue that people in the South and people in rural communities can talk about racial power and racial injustice. So it just takes a while to do those kind of, in a white state, predominantly white state like Kentucky. But the cohort that we have with the National Endowment for the Arts, we intentionally built racial inclusivity, racial and ethnic inclusivity into our cohort. So we have Kentucky, we have LA Commons, which Karen Mack is doing amazing work in African American community in LA. And we have the Arts Foundation for Tucson in Arizona, who's doing with Latinx and American Indian culture, and also Arts and Democracy, which works in New York and also in Brooklyn. So you have to really think about it and work hard on it, and we're still a long way from, but I do honestly think we're moving the needle. It might not look like that sometimes, but we're trying to build those relationships.
Mm-hmm. Thanks to each of you. I would just add, and each of you touched on this, I love that question included the word apparently, because
Mm-hmm.
it really depends what lens you're looking through, and that there are some assumptions the work isn't happening. But I think it's happening differently. I think it has happened for a long time in communities of color. It might look and feel differently. It might not have the same words attached to it, but one certainly shouldn't assume it's not happening. It's just that the visibility and the perceived legitimacy might be different. And tools like research, I think in particular, can go a long way at shedding light on inequity when it comes to funding for that work that would perhaps make it more visible, and really be a tool for accountability and transparency. So we're trying to bring that. So I think we have one more time for one more question here. We've got a great one from Ray Strobel. I'm interested in language and ways Erica found language as a barrier, and wondering what kind of language was most effective in working with many different kinds of people in rural communities. All right, Erica, how do we talk to each other and hear each other? Have you solved that one?
Well, it's a case-by-case basis. I mean, when you're talking to your neighbor, part of it is looking for the similarities and seeing what cross language or simplification of terms, not in talking down to, but in being as clear as possible in the simplest terms, with not just what you are wanting or needing from the conversation, but also what they are wanting or needing. In talking within the agricultural community, farmers understand one thing that's key to the artist industry is that it takes a year's worth of investment for a 1-month payoff. And so thinking about somebody else's industry and what they might be dealing with, if you understand that as an artist, all of a sudden it's really easy to talk to somebody about, well, you know, this canvas that I had to invest in and all the primer for it and the $80 brushes are very much like your combine. You're going to use it once. And I'm going to use this once, and I can't bill anybody for that. I can only bill people for that final product sold or the facilitation of that product. So it's really more of a being fluent enough in a lot of different languages to be able to find out what your common language is. It's kind of finding that common denominator. And even if that common denominator is only that you're neighbors, only that you live side by side, that's at least a starting point to figure out what the common concerns are and then build a dialogue from there. And being super conscious of somebody gives you that look when you say, we're going to have a dialogue. Oh, no, we're going to chat. So it could just be an internal, we should act more like tax preparers, because tax preparers are translating this thing that impacts all of our lives and is incredibly convoluted and weird and bizarre. And we go to them with this pile of paper saying, what does this mean? I want to be a good citizen. I want to do this right, but I have no idea what any of this language is. Can you help me sort through it? So they translate their industry into something that people across industries can understand, and also have to know that, yeah, the combine's a giant tax deductible item, and where does that go? So I think if we had like little offices where you could take two people who want to do something and don't know how to talk to each other and just sit them down with universal languages and can break down or even just identify, hey, that's a weird word. What did you mean by that? It would create easier communication within all of us. And we might just need to develop that within our own heads, a little red flag of, whoa, jargon talk. What are you talking about?
I love that, Erica. With that, I just want to share some closing observations and let Katie know. Katie, I see your question and I'm going to shoot you a note afterwards. Erica, I love that you sort of touched on the need for almost exchange programs, right? For those of us who have traveled to other parts of our town or our state or the country, you know, there's nothing like dropping yourself inside of someone else's reality to get a sense of what of your reality resonates with them or doesn't. You know, so I think the more time we can spend with each other, learning from each other, in that kind of knowledge exchange, the better. And I would just say that, you know, the three themes that just continue to reoccur across this conversation, again, the critical nature of language and being intentional about translating in ways that resonates with people, builds common ground, builds common understanding, is a huge learning outcome and one we will all continue to aspire for. Because that really allows communities to adapt, it allows us to evolve our work, and that really facilitates change, which I think is what we're all really after. Also keeping outcomes firmly in mind as we produce these knowledge tools, you know, what are we really, what is that aspirational future we're trying to create? And what are the skills and capacities that are needed to get there? And making sure that these tools, whether they're workshops or toolkits or reports, really help to build the scaffolding for us to get there, and to make sure the content of these knowledge building tools is that combination of that bottom-up intelligence of communities and top-down expertise. And in that way, really mirroring the best of what creative placemaking, I think we all hope it's all about. So with that, I'm going to turn back to Matt to close this off, and thank you very much to each of our panelists for sharing your experiences with us, and to all the participants.
Kylie, thank you so much for moderating for us this last hour. And Carl, Erica, Judy, thank you so much for your time. We're really, really grateful. We're grateful for the folks who gathered with us all across the country to have this conversation over the last hour. As folks are transitioning and kind of in line with these last couple of thoughts about how do we meet our neighbors and how do we share this work across kind of different lines of language and stuff like that, Please feel free to join us on August 9th. That's a Wednesday at noon Eastern time for our next digital exchange, which will be looking at arts and engagement with the Community Heart and Soul program. And for folks who maybe need some context or aren't familiar, the Orton Family Foundation's Community Heart and Soul program is a process that's designed to increase participation in local decision-making and empower residents to shape their future within their communities. Our digital exchange webinar will offer an opportunity to learn from 3 diverse examples of arts and creative placemaking projects through this heart and soul process, with towns that have used storytelling to identify common cause and that have employed community values to shape their physical places where they work and live. We're gonna have a really great set of panelists for this conversation. We'll have Caitlin Davison from the Orton Family Foundation, Shane Hale from the city of Cortez, Colorado, Debbie Moreno from Galesburg On Track, and Jason Nises from the Community Foundation of Greater Dubuque. So a lot of the ideas and resources and seeds that were planted today can kind of come out of the ground in different ways on August 9th. So again, thanks to Kylie, Carl, Erica, and Judy. Thanks to the folks who joined us today. I hope you all have a fantastic afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.